You who are joining for the first time today, Third Path Institute is a national nonprofit getting ready to celebrate our 20th anniversary. And long before others discovered the importance of including men in the work-life integration discussion, or the science of pushing back at overwhelm so we can all work smarter, we were showing people how to do work, family, and leadership differently. Did you know that over 71,000 people checked out our free resources last year, like the live and recorded versions of our Thursday with Third Path webinars? We're glad you're here today. And as I say every Thursday webinar, I'm super excited about today's guest and topic. I'm sure it's going to be another great event. So welcome, Brigid. You know I love having you on our Thursday webinars. I have loved getting to know you all these years. I have loved the work you've done all, of course, across your whole career. And of course, writing Overwhelmed was an amazing highlight for me, and seeing what you wrote about Third Path in there. But you've been up to some really wonderful work, really looking at how organizations benefit from pushing back at overwhelm. Or there might be something else you want to talk about a little bit about that, what you've been up to lately. Tell us, Brigid, what have you been up to?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's always such a delight to talk with you. You know, you really are such a forward thinker, and the organization it just does such important and forward-thinking work. You are ahead of your time, and I'm hoping the times will catch up with you
Thank you.
because it's so important. Um, so yeah, as you know, we met when I was reporting my book, Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And that experience, not only did you help transform my marriage, which was about hanging by a thread at that point, but the process of working on that book really changed the trajectory of my life and my life's work, I would say. I've really the work that I'm doing now, I moved from the Washington Post to the Better Life Lab, where I'm the director. It's a nonprofit program at New America, where really my job is to get up every day and try to figure out how to solve all the problems that I wrote about in Overwhelmed, about how to do better work, how to combine it with meaningful time for family and for people you love and community. How do you bring in time for joy and leisure and play? So the Better Life Lab is the work life, gender equity, and social policy program here. And so a couple things. I would say I've been really focusing, we focus a lot on public policies that can really help people combine work and life, like paid family leave and childcare. And we really look really broadly at gender equality. You know, we think not just about women and women's advancement at work, but men and their role in care and caregiving in the private sphere, and also thinking really broadly across the gender spectrum. So that what we're really talking about is a truly human future. What we're talking about in terms of work and work culture, it is really a human-centered capitalism, if you will. How do we bring workers, well-being, human beings back into the way that we think about the economy and GDP and growth? So those are some of the things that we're working on. And I would say, most pressing for me, I'm working on a project that really looks at overwork and work-life conflict through the lens of behavioral science, trying to understand sort of human decision making and not only sort of the drivers, what drives overwork and overwhelm, but how can we design interventions and nudges within work culture to make those changes, to reduce overwork, to promote more effective work, to reduce work-life conflict in a way that work gets better, work and life get better, families get better, people get happier and healthier, and companies perform better, and the society works better. So that's the
Yeah.
big project that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, no, and in fact, that's why I picked you for this particular webinar. As you might remember, we've been exploring, Anne Marie Slaughter is actually the CEO of New America, and so it's really lovely to have both of you there. And we've been looking at her 5 mandates for change. We added the one about win-win boundary setting to them, and all year long we've been looking at these mandates. And I particularly wanted to have you join us when we looked at this, pinnacle mandate, become an innovation nation, because I think really that's what you're talking about, is that this is about a better, healthier, more thriving families, organizations, and society. And so we're going to be looking at this today. How can we become this innovation nation? What's getting in the way? And what Brigid and I have both come to the conclusion is, overwork is really a big problem. So I'm going to explain this picture a little bit, and then you and I can have some laughs about it, because I know you and I, wrestle with this issue ourselves.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Physician, heal thyself. Yes, yes, yes.
so, we know each other well, and we worked on this for a long time. And, and I'm going to get to a slide in a little bit that shows that this problem about overwork, interestingly, coincides with when Third Path started. There was an emerging problem of overwork happening at the same time, which is kind of interesting to think about. But here we are. If we think of ourselves as a battery, where each of us has a certain amount of energy, and ideally, we can get to our workplaces where we have time for work, and we can get home and have time for home, and we still have time in the week or in that day for recharging as well. And so what Third Path's been learning about for the last 20 years is, in order to achieve that, we got to get better at what we call firm but flexible boundary setting. That's what that black line is around the battery. You got to get smarter and smarter about how much work can you really take on, so you have time and energy to be involved with your caregiving needs, whether those are children or aging parents, and most importantly, you have time to recharge. I know this is something we keep on working at. What do you think, Brigid? Has this been an easy thing for us to learn about, for you to learn about? What do you think?
No, it's not. This is really hard. And the reason it's hard is really, it's one of the main points that I want to make today. When we talk a lot about work-life issues, or we talk about work, there's a lot of popular literature about life hacks, about productivity hacks, and that's it's all sort of in this language of personal choice and willpower, as if you could make the decision not to overwork, as if a work-life conflict were sort of something that you just haven't figured out. You're not good at setting boundaries. And while there is an element of individual responsibility and choice, there's no doubt about it. I think what it's so important, and we're not having this conversation yet, we need to recognize that this is really a systems problem, and that human beings are very influenced by the environment around them. That's a lot of the work with behavioral science that I'm doing, that in terms of where humans, or how humans make their choices, we're very influenced by our environment. And right now, our environment pushes us to overwork. If we want to, if think about the language of work. Do you go above and beyond? Are you giving me 120%? I want your all. Are you dedicated? So we're working in environments where busyness is valued, where overwork is actually rewarded, where presence and time on the job, regardless of what your performance is. I mean, think about the billable hours culture. You can do a crummy job, but if you bill a bunch of hours, you're actually rewarded for that because you're bringing in more money, which is sort of frankly, the definition of insanity. We we've kind of got these equations all wrong. We've got our reward and incentive structures all wrong, and we've created this environment that really fosters overwork and work-life conflict. So the first thing I want people to recognize is that, if you're thinking it's like, oh God, it's a diet and I'm not doing well, or it's this, it's like it's all about willpower. We really need to be thinking about the environment, the culture, and the systems and the structures that we are creating. And that's why policy is so important. Policy sort of is a way that we as a nation say what's important to us. And if we have a workforce that is made up of half women, and if we have a majority of mothers who work, and we do not have supports like childcare or paid family leave, if we do not have flexible work opportunities, or if you take them, they're seen as sort of the mommy track mommy track death trap that you'll never get out of. Our systems are not aligned with the way people live and work. And so that's one
Yeah.
of the first things that I want people to recognize. There
Yeah.
are certain things that you can do, but the most important thing to think about is, sure, life hacks, productivity hacks. You definitely have to put those boundaries on, recognize that it's difficult, create those networks of peers where you can support each other, and think that you're really putting your oxygen mask on so that you can work together for this bigger change that we all need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, so the slides that's up now is talking about how we had a pretty amazing summit that we call it the Pioneering Leader Summit. We have it every other year. This year it was on April 10th, and I was really glad to have Brigid there, and you're actually going to hear from somebody else who was there later in the call. And, we were really taking a deep dive and look at this because here's the interesting truth. What I started to see is this overwork. Let me reframe how to say this. I work in a supportive workplace. I have a supportive boss, my board. I have a great team of people, and I'm still struggling with overwork sometimes. And so when I got that amazing group of leaders together at that Pioneering Leader Summit, who all want to follow this integrated approach, I saw it as an opportunity for us to get smarter about, so what's really going on here? Like, yeah, okay, there's some pretty lousy organizations out there, but what about these organizations that really want to do it differently? What can we learn around overwork that's making it hard for us? And I don't even think we got all the way through the topic on April 10th, but we really had a great conversation. And one of the frames that we were trying to talk about is exactly what you're saying. It's a systems issue. There's multiple forces at work. I'm going to jump to the next slide because even beyond the system, or maybe because of the system, you introduced me to an amazing book, Jeffrey Pfeiffer, and he's got a pretty scary message in that book about how overwork is impacting us. You want to talk a little bit about that, Brigid?
Yeah, I sort of fell into his finding out about his research when before his book came out, and he was just writing academic papers on this, and it was really astounding what he's a Stanford business professor, and he was actually working on the university, was sort of on one of the committees looking at the healthcare in the university, and he was just really looking at all of the stress and all these sort of chronic stress-related chronic illnesses and seeing how it was tied to work. And he got really interested at how expensive it was just to have people so stressed out from work. So he teamed up with some other professors from Harvard, and what they did is they looked at what they called 10 psychosocial stressors, work-related stressors. And so usually when you think about work and how it affects your health, we think of like OSHA, you fall off a ladder, or you're in a coal mine and you have black lung. And so he wanted to look at sort of the more modern what he calls like these psychosocial stressors, like long work hours or work-life conflict, or if you have a toxic boss, or if you don't feel supported, or if you're not getting the rewards for the work that you're putting in, and you kind of feel like you're not appreciated, or if you don't have access to health care. And so they took these 10 factors, and then they looked at all this health data, and they came up with these really rigorous like ways to measure impact. And they actually found that the stress, work-related stress that's leading to these chronic illnesses has actually made the modern workplace the 5th leading cause of death in the United States, leading
Wow.
to like $190 billion of excess healthcare costs a year.
Yeah.
Basically more deaths than secondhand smoke, which is a known and regulated carcinogen. On par, the healthcare effects are on par with diabetes, where we have, millions and billions that we invest in research and mitigation, and nobody's paying attention to this.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, and again, no big. I mean, one of the funnier things, not funny. Sorry, that's the wrong way to say it. I felt like it was interesting to read that his advice was to, his advice to people is like find a better workplace because he is really serious that this is really deadly for you to stay in these toxic workplaces. But again, what was interesting here, we have this summit every 2 years with these amazing leaders, and I think the message we're trying to get at is even in places where we're trying to be smart, we're trying to be constructive, it's still challenging. And, nevertheless, no big surprise when I read Jeffrey Pfeiffer's book, he really points the finger at something we've been talking a long time about at Third Path called this work first work culture. And so I've got a slide up there that talks about what is a work first work culture and how, it really creates this 24/7 responsiveness expectation, and, evening and weekend work has become the norm, and people are even working on their vacations, and you have these, people at the top who, work all the time, and that there's really some problems with these work cultures. No big surprise. It's, that, sorry, going the wrong way. Oh, I know. I skipped a slide. There it is. We get less diversity at the top, problems with women's advancement, difficulty attracting and retaining millennials. But what you've added and what Jeffrey Pfeiffer has added is this idea that this is really a health issue. These work first work cultures really create some problems around health. And then the work you've been doing is there's also some problems around lack of efficiency. And that's what I want to talk about next. I have a slide that you've all seen before on our Thursday webinars, but Brigid, this is what we've been looking at, right? When you have chronic overwork, it turns out we don't work so well. Want to talk some more about that?
Yeah, so that's so interesting. We have it's almost like a religious belief that the more you work and the longer you work, the harder you work, the better your work is. And, and I certainly believe that. I do want to be cognizant that many workers are doing more with less. You certainly saw that after the Great Recession.
Yeah.
But and overwork tends to be kind of a professional and managerial class issue, just that's sort of how we think about it. But I also want people to recognize that in the lower wage work, hourly workers or even middle wage workers, they may have fewer hours at one job, but they're also trying to cobble together a couple different jobs or a side hustle or a gig. So we're not even capturing their longer work hours in our data. But I
Yeah.
think what's important to recognize, and Jeff Pfeffer actually showed me, there's a couple other indicators that I use, but one that he told me about that I thought was so brilliant. uh, there's this big graph that The Economist published, and it showed the average work hours of all these different advanced economies. And what you could see is the longer the work hours, the productivity levels, just it was an absolute one-to-one relationship. That the longer the hours, the lower the productivity.
Yeah.
And that's sort of one of the things that I've looked at is, you know, uh, international measures of productivity per hours worked to kind of get a sense of like, well, all right, you work long hours. How good are those hours? Or are you like
Yes.
surfing Facebook and going and chatting about the football game, and you're at work, so you think it's work, and you kind of get the benefits of from your boss of being there, but are you really doing good work? And what those measures find, that the countries that have the longest work hours are like Japan and South Korea, and they have the lowest hourly productivity. So
Yeah.
so that's one thing to remember. And then another Stanford professor, John Pencavel, he did some really interesting work looking at, all right, well, how long can a human being really be productive? I mean, we know from the manual labor, from some of Henry Ford's work, that's where the 40-hour work week, 5 days a week, came from. That for a
Yeah.
manual laborer, that's about as much as you could do before you started getting tired or making mistakes and ending up costing more money. That was sort of the sweet spot for a manual laborer. And we don't really quite know what the sweet spot is for a knowledge worker, or somebody who works in a different kind of non-manual labor kind of um, uh, situation. And what he found, though, that was so interesting is he said that you can push yourself and be more productive for a short period of time, like 50 hours a week. But once you hit, if you do that for, say 3 to 6 weeks, you kind of get back to the point where if you just worked 40 hours all along, you would have gotten to the same point, because
Yeah.
after a
Let's talk
while,
about that. Yeah. Let's talk about
yeah,
that because
yeah,
this
after
is
a while you
something.
get tired and stupid
Yeah.
and you start making mistakes and you can't think clearly.
Well, it's even more than that. So the reason we got this whole concept of chronic overwork or episodic overwork is because, again, we have this amazing community of leaders that have been really helping Third Path, really think smart about what's the future of workplaces. And so Ben Applegate's the one who taught us about this chronic overwork versus episodic overwork. And he made the analogy, if you worked in manufacturing, if you worked a machine, 100%, 365 days a year, there'd be problems because the machine would break down. So even machines break down. So of course, people need slower periods. But what we've learned over the last 10 years working with these amazing leaders, the slower periods are as important as the peak periods. Yes, we make more money at the peak period, but the slower periods, especially in white collar jobs, is when you can start thinking about, hey, I should be delegating this particular part of my job to somebody else so that during the next peak period, I'm not doing it anymore. And if you're just going from peak to peak to peak and never slowing down and really rethinking and looking for those efficiencies, you're not actually making the best choices of how to use your time. So it just becomes a negative cycle, this chronic overwork. I know I'm preaching to the choir. What do you think?
Well, yeah. So to that very point that you made, there was a piece that I wrote recently that was published in the Harvard Business Review that kind of gets to that point, and it's based on some of the work that I'm doing on behavioral science, health, and work-life conflict, and sort of work culture that I'm doing with Ideas 42, which is a behavioral science nonprofit, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And the foundation's very interested in how do you promote a culture of health, and they're beginning to see how work is a huge part of what's keeping us from that culture of health. And what
Yeah.
was interesting about that, we were doing some site work, just trying to figure out, we're working with nonprofits right now, trying to figure out, well, what are some of the drivers of work-life conflict or their pain points that they're dealing with. And one thing that struck me over and over again was how everyone was saying, we all value work-life balance. We all say the right things, and then we're not doing it because
Yeah.
we all think that we have to be busy and we're all working these long hours, and we think that, that's sort of how we have to do it. And what's interesting is that there's this phenomenon in behavioral science that they found through doing a number of different studies. They call it tunneling, that when we get really busy and then we have sort of a scarcity of time and you have that sort of ratcheting up of stress and there's hecticness and you're answering emails and you're going to the meetings and and you're kind of in that constant churn mode, like you say, you don't have those peaks and valleys. You're just like you're, like I'm
Yep.
getting it done. What happens is actually this phenomenon called tunneling, that our cognitive ability to think actually narrows. And so we're really, like, if you think about what it looks like in a tunnel, you're only able to focus on the things just directly in front of you, which are often low value tasks. The like, I got to get to the end of this email, and no, I got to run to this next meeting. And what you're not able to do is take that step back, get out of the tunnel, see the bigger picture, figure out what is really most important. How do I do it? How do I delegate it? All of those things that you were saying that you could do in that slower period of time. A
Yep.
lot of times we're not giving ourselves the permission to take that time to step back and
Yeah.
think about systems and being more strategic, because we value busyness and
Yeah.
because it looks like we're productive even when we're not.
Yeah.
And so then what happens is it becomes this terrible, vicious, self-reinforcing cycle where we stay busy, so we stay focused on the low value stuff. We don't get to our big, our big and most important things, and yet we're getting accolades outside from it because, oh, wow, she looks really busy. She must be important, even though you're not really doing really good work.
Yeah, so what you're getting at is what, we're going to get to in a couple slides, is this question, where do we begin? Do we begin as a person changing our behavior? Do we begin, fantasy, suddenly a great organization that gets it? We're going to talk about that in a second. Where do we begin to make some change? But before we get there, there was a fabulous article that came out just so recently by Claire King Miller, who does great work on this topic too. And I put the graph up that was from the article. I strongly recommend reading this article because what she shows us is, there's this financial story behind overwork as well. And what you're seeing in this graph is that for the first time in history, people working more than 50 hours a week are actually getting rewarded disproportionately more for working more hours. So there's actually a financial reward for how this plays out for people. And so, again, there's many drivers for why we're overworking. One of them is this financial driver. And by the way, if you're listening in today, part 2 of today's call is happening on June 13th at our summits. Of course, we look at the work side of things, but we also look at the family side of things. And so we really wanted to ask the question is, how is overwork playing out on families? And so we're going to have our 9th annual Father's Day webinar on June 13th, and we're going to be talking about how overwork impacts families and how money is connected to all of that. So make sure you come back June 13th for that webinar. So you saw this article too. What I thought was one of the most amazing quotes from the article is, the nature of work has changed in ways that push couples who have equal career potential to take on unequal roles. I know I'm, again, preaching to the choir. This is stuff you've been thinking about. Any thoughts about this way that money plays into all this?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is really important. This is some of the economic work that economists like Claudia Golden has been writing about. That it very true. It used to be if you worked if you worked overtime, unless you were an hourly worker, because the only sort of the Fair Labor Standards Act, it only protected hourly workers, and it said if you work over 40 hours, then you get time and a half. Well, what's happened is that the number of salaried workers has actually exploded in ways that people couldn't have imagined in the 1930s when that law passed. And so now you've got a growth of like 7 times as many salaried employees as back then, and you're not protected at all. And it used to be that if you did, I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed people, and they'll be so puzzled. They'll say, my dad, he was a lawyer, or my dad, he was a surgeon, and he was always home for dinner at 5. Why is it that we can't do that anymore? And that really did start to change in the 1980s, where you did start to see this shift. And part of this, think about what happened in the 1980s. We had a whole lot of deregulation. This was the Reagan era. We had, government is bad, big government is bad. And, we had the beginnings of all the mergers and acquisitions on Wall Street and the financialization of the economy. And this is when companies stopped really reinvesting in their workers and their workforces, and really started focusing on those, stock, shareholder reports and return on investment, and CEO salaries started really getting crazy. So this was the beginning of, also the really grotesque inequity that you see. This is the beginning of workers' wages starting to stagnate, and most of the benefit of all the productivity that has continued to increase has been going to the top 1%. So some of this overwork are as part of these much larger sort of economic, is not only demographic but economic trends that have really reshaped our economy, and in a way that's really impacted human beings and families' ability to flourish.
Yeah. And again, I got to keep one eye on the clock. I mean, luckily, I think why I've been able to stay positive and hopeful in the work I've done for 20 years is because there are some leaders out there who are really trying to create a very different kind of organization. And what we're going to be talking today is a sad truth that I've been learning, which is I actually don't have a lot of hope in organizations changing unless they figure out how to support people to move ahead into leadership positions where they've actually had time for their lives. Because over the last couple of years, I've really seen that when you have leaders who don't have a life outside of work, they don't seem to have the imagination or the willpower to make change. But when you can create these strategically flexible work cultures, which, by the way, we are really in touch with leaders who are doing this or really striving to do this, there are so many benefits. I've listed a few on this slide. Again, just jumping ahead. What we tried to do at the summit was give everybody a case study to think about how to talk about this overwork problem. As Brigid said, we tend to personalize it and feel like we are failing when we don't get all of our work done. we don't see it in larger context of what else is influencing the situation. And so we gave everybody, before they even walked into the summit, a case study. We called it the Tammy case study. It's a true story about a person who I know, who I remember talking to, early in the fall, and she was overwhelmed. And then, talked to again a little bit later, and she was even more overwhelmed. And, we were just thinking about what was going on. And I think what I want to get to is this question about, yes, I think there's something Tammy needed to learn and Tammy needed to do, but there's something about her organization and her boss that are influencing this as well. And so what we're trying to get to, and again, we're short on time, so we can't spend too much time talking about this, is, so where does it begin? The person, the organization. Before I put up the next slide, what would you bet? The person, the organization, a combination, what would you bet, Brigid?
Well, I think it's really important, but, and I realize, oh man, I've just been talking about the problem. I think it's important to have hope, and to recognize that we do need solutions because the consequences are huge.
Oh my God.
I've been writing a lot about health, but we also have a declining birth rate. So, we got to be able to perpetuate the country. So the consequences are huge. The consequences to innovation are huge, like you mentioned. And so I think that you do have to have hope, and you do have to think we do need to work at the individual level, at the team level, at the organizational level, and also thinking larger, in terms of society and culture and how we talk about things. And just really briefly, one thing to think about, you talk about, kind of the pulses or using downtime. I think neuroscience can be really helpful in making these cases about really effective work. What neuroscience is showing us is that insight or creativity or new ideas that only come when our brain is in this kind of relaxed and kind of daydreamy, diffuse mode. And so the more that we recognize that, and there's actually, a reason why you get your best ideas in the shower, and try to create spaces like that in the way that we work, I think the better the work is going to get. And the more that we create networks where we can reinforce this, and we study it with, with stories and with data, and we show role models of people doing it differently, because I think what we've got is a real failure of imagination. And so the more that we can fill that in and show people it's, how it can work,
Yeah.
I think that will go a long way in making it happen.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what was so fun, and I'm sure you saw this, it's like when you bring together a group of people who are committed to thinking differently about this, and they've been out there experimenting, and they're in a position as a leader in their organization to really implement some ideas, amazing things can happen. So at the summit, we explored this idea, and it was kind of a first. I kind of tried to raise the bar and say, okay, folks, we got this overwork problem. How are we going to start getting smarter about this overwork problem? And we were using this term collective boundary setting, because I think what Brigid and I are both saying is Tammy can't do it by herself, but Tammy needs to be sophisticated in her understanding of all the different players, and then make some choices about how she wants to move forward. And she has to manage her own life and a family situation, and in context of where she is. And so in the Tammy case study, what you can see is that she's done a great job over the course of her career learning some skills. These are the things that Third Path's been teaching people for years now. It's the idea that we can really do work differently in a way that makes sense. You and I both use different language, but this concept of quiet time, like in order for people to actually think creatively, they need some quiet space. Hey, it turns out when you turn off work on vacations, you actually come back better and more refreshed. And it means you get your team to work more collaboratively to figure out how to support each other to take vacations. So there's all these benefits of teaching some integration skills. But Tammy also really did some great things on the home front about how to manage things together as a family system around this. The big question we were trying to ask at the summit, though, was what about the role of the leader? How does the leader help or hurt these issues? And just how challenging is it to be a leader and also model integration. And that's where I want to go next, because I think for years, we blamed men that they're the problem. And hopefully Third Pass helped change that scenario. But I think there's a tendency to blame leaders. And yes, there probably are some pretty awful leaders out there. I'm not even pretending to say that there aren't some awful leaders out there. But I think what we've been learning in this crazy diagram that I'm showing now is that it's hard to be a leader and set some boundaries today. There are so many factors influencing us that make it difficult, that to try to model work-life integration in the middle of this multi-force thing that's pushing us towards overwork is pretty challenging. I'm going to take us through this diagram in a second. You saw it at the summit. Is there something you want to say first before I kind of walk through this diagram a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think that this is really important for people to recognize that it's not all up to them. They do have a role to play, but this is a complex systems issue. And that's
Yeah.
really why the work that I'm doing, and I'm happy to talk about that later, is really taking that systems approach, but then also looking at nudges. What can you do that's small enough to make a little bit of a difference, and can that ripple out and lead to more change?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, so maybe you can even think about it from your own experiences. I can certainly relate to this from my experiences. Here you are, you're a leader of a group. Here I am, the leader of a group. So this is personal. We've experienced some of this stuff, and so for those of you who've been listening into the webinars this year, you know that I've been dealing with a lot of elder care stuff. And so, elder care is super unexpected. And so both Jeff and I, my husband and I, have been dealing with, some stress from elder care. Jeff also has been going through some really busy things in his workplace. So that's been an added stress in our lives. Luckily, I've got great clients and customers. Third Path works with great people, so that isn't a big challenge. But if you work in a workplace that's not so supportive, like Tammy, your boss could be setting up some really unexpected, difficult goals that are unachievable with the resources that you have. You could be competing with some peers to get that bonus or to get that promotion, and so you have to work longer hours just to try to be able to get ahead. Or as a team leader, one of the best ways we find work-life balance as a team leader is to have a strong team that we can really rely on to support each other to manage things. But Brigid, you probably know, creating a really strong team is not an easy thing. It's a lot of work.
It is, and
Any,
it's a work, and it's a work in progress,
oh my
because
gosh,
any one of these things can change on a dime, you know,
yes.
and that even when you have the best of intentions, there can be unintended consequences. That's certainly what I'm learning.
Yeah,
But I will say, just even small little nudges can go a long way. Like,
yeah,
I used to send email at all hours just because I came from a newspaper culture where that was just, news does go on all the time. And that was
yeah,
just part of the culture. And it's also a real crazy overwork, workaholic kind of culture as well.
yeah,
And then when I came here to a think tank and I was sending it at all hours, I needed to do it because I needed to get an idea out of my head. And then I got relief. It's like
yes,
it sort of relieved my cognitive bandwidth. But what I didn't recognize was that what I was doing then was creating so much stress on all of the people who worked for me, because now I was the boss, I was the leader, who felt, even if I'd said, oh, you don't need to read this now, or, oh, even put in, no need to respond. But even if I'd said that, there was still this power dynamic, and they felt that they had to do something, some kind of,
right.
they had to think about it or read it, or like even notice, like, oh God, she sent me an email and it's 11 o'clock. And I was creating so much unnecessary stress. And then I saw the research that showed that the anticipation of getting an email from a boss in off hours creates more stress than actually getting the email. Because what we're
Mm,
doing is we're putting our team in this constant vigilant state, like, oh my God, is it coming? And so that's one of the first things that I've tried to do as a leader is we created Slack channels so that if I have something in my head that I need to get out, I need that ability to get it out. And so it gives me the ability to get it out. But then since it's a Slack channel, there isn't an expectation that that you'll read it or respond to it right away or even ever. It just gives you, sort of like this kind of running channel of what's happening. So it
yeah,
created relief for me, but it also reduced the stress on the team. I also schedule things to go out. I use Boomerang on Gmail, so that there are things that you can do, even small nudges like that, that go a
Yeah,
long way to preserving, preserving some of that cognitive bandwidth and some of the time of your team.
yeah, yeah. Wow. So, again, there's a couple more things we're going to point at today, but I want to make sure we get to one of the other participants who was at the summit with us. I have some slides to show what an amazing day it was. And, one of the things Third Path worked very hard at is making sure we really include men in the conversation. And I was very proud to have almost 50% of the attendees as men. It was a great day. And I think what Brigid's pointing out is that when you get a group of people together to think differently, who are already trying to think differently, lots of good ideas get surfaced. And so one of the other things we talked about at the summit was, part of it's what's happening on the work side, part of it's what's happening on the family side. And that what we're really seeing is that when you support a family system, whether that's two parents who are married, two parents who are separated, a single parent who's thinking about these issues, when you get family systems to think about this, and both in a two-parent household, both parents committed to having a life where you have time for work, but also time for your life outside of work, you get smarter as a family system about this, and it gives you some courage to keep on pushing and making change. And so I did some interviews in the middle of the summit where we heard from some of the pioneers. You see their faces sit on this slide. And the big takeaway for me, and this was something I hadn't thought about, Brigid, was that now that I've worked with these leaders for like 10 years, I see a pattern, and I want to talk about this for a second. So I might have had a leader who, when the baby was born, some cases it's the dad who stayed home, some cases it's the mom who stayed home. But what happens is over time, their kids grow up and they shift things. And so although the families that I worked with might have looked very different at the beginning, another family might have both worked full time right from the start. And then their kids grew up and they had school age kids. Well, what I started seeing was, yes, families might look very different how they manage work and family at the start when there's little children at home. But when in a two-parent household or in a single-parent household that's committed to this, when they're committed to living a life where they're doing great work, but also having time for their lives, they start looking similar after a while because kids grow up. And so just being able to work full-time but flexibly becomes a very successful solution for so many people. And there's just this very short amount of time at the beginning when they're trying to balance work and very young children that things are different. So let me try that one more time and see what you think. The point being that when you get both parents in a two-parent household or a single parent committed to work and family over time, we don't look that different. We want a flexible workplace that supports us to have time and energy to do a good job at work and have time for our families. And you can become someone who works full time flexibly and make it all work. Am I saying something that makes sense? It was kind of I just started seeing how we're not that different as time goes on. What do you think about that?
I think it's so interesting, and I think you're right. Again, sometimes maybe we've all been in the tunnel ourselves as we think about some of these work-life issues, and I think it's really important that we think about these over our life cycle,
Yes.
because our lives are long, and our priorities change, the pressures change,
Yeah.
children grow up, parents age, we get ill, we get
Yes.
better. And I think it really is important to kind of widen the aperture and think about work life, work family as really something that it's not sort of one period or one person. It really is about all of us and how do we make this work throughout our lives?
Yeah, yeah, well said. And I'm sorry to rush us, but I'm going to actually skip the next slide, and then I'm going to go to, let's see if I can get my pointer to work. And I'm going to say that, one of the things that we did talk about at the summit, I talk about over and over again on the Thursday webinars, I don't want to pretend this is easy. I don't want to pretend this is easy. everybody in that summit, and that's one of the things I did when I interviewed them, was I had them talk about where they had to be courageous, because they didn't have to be courageous once. They had to be courageous over and over and over again, both at work and at home. They had to have a number of courageous conversations. And so, again, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but, I'm imagining that you would agree with that, and you might have a quick sentence you want to say about it.
No, I just think that that's a brilliant way of looking at it, and I think you're the one that taught me that, just that can be a really helpful way of looking at things, being clear on
Yeah.
where you are, really taking time to imagine where you want to go, and then thinking about it, it's play, it's experimenting. How do you get from here to there?
Yeah, and try to avoid the temptation of lowering our goals. Instead, get some support to keep on striving for our goals and to get past that feeling of hopelessness or discouragement that can surface as we're trying to reach for. We're really trying to do something very different than what's surrounding us, and that requires some courage. So, long story short, I think what we've really learned is that if we really want to make change, it's about what you're doing, what we're doing. You need to get smarter about how we can do integration better. We need to include men and women in the issue. And we need to really make sure we reach and include some leaders in this concept as well. I'm running out of time, so I can't talk about this with you, but as we started the call, we don't have, maybe what I'll say is, those who stick around today for the live Q&A, we can come back to this slide. The point is that Brigid's really got she's a good thinker, and she's aware that what we're talking about has huge impact on society. And I'd love for us to come back to that in the live Q&A and to think a little bit about pushing back at overwork is good for us, but this is about really making a better society too. So we're going to get back to that in a second. I want to make sure I get a chance to hear from every Thursday webinar this year. We have one of our integrated life advocates join us. It's a chance for them to hear us have this conversation and then be able to add some thoughts to the conversation. Today we're running a little bit late, so we're gonna, have about 5 minutes to hear from Kelly, and then we're gonna have a few minutes for live Q&A afterwards. Kelly, sorry, when Brigid gets going, she's got so many good things to say. It's hard to interrupt her because we want to hear everything.
Shut her up. Sorry.
No, it was all good stuff, all really good stuff. But I know that Kelly, it was really fun to have you at the summit as well. Great to have you part of the ILA community. In particular, you actually were part of the Courageous Conversations at Work table at the summit. What were tell us a little about who you are and what were some highlights from the Courageous Conversations at Work table?
Hi, everybody. I am a journalist, and I'm working on a book that relates to these issues. And when we talked about with a group of people at the summit about this Courageous Conversations at Work, one of the things that was so striking was that there were all different kinds of people at this table. There were maybe 12 of us, and people were in different fields and different stages in their career. And some people worked in big organizations, and some people were entrepreneurs, and it was women and men at different ages. And they chose this topic. So there's something about the question of courage, I think, that is really getting to people's both desire and fear about setting some boundaries at work. So a couple takeaways that I thought might be useful to this group. One, we were really guided by an idea that Jessica proposed, which is before you even go to work with this idea, whoever you need to tell about how you're going to set some boundaries, the first step is really to talk to your people at home about it and really get clear on home. So I thought that was just a great way already to take this work first culture and leave it aside and start with the home. Start with what you wanted in your home, and then see how work could fit in with that. So that notion of courageous conversations at work, basically begin with a courageous conversation at home, really resonated with the group. That made a lot of sense to them. People who had had come up with some solutions said that they had used that model. And one point that they made was that they had to continue to have those conversations.
Yeah.
at home and at work, because just as work is very dynamic and fluid and changes, home is dynamic and fluid and changes. So this is an ongoing conversation, and the solutions for these folks had looked different over time. But one person pointed out that the values didn't change. Once he and his wife had articulated the values of what they wanted, the values stayed the same. And then the
Yes.
solutions look different at different times. And
Yes. Yeah.
I will just add, after the summit, I had to make kind of a difficult work decision about whether to apply for a new job at my organization. And I followed your advice, Jessica. I got in touch with my husband. He and I did a radical thing, which is that we both took leave from work for 2 hours so we could sit down together and talk about how this new job opportunity might fit into our vision for our family and our longer term plan. And in the end, I decided not to apply for the job, but we came up with a different solution.
Yes.
And this was another point that came up in the summit, which is just having the conversation sometimes presents solutions that you hadn't seen before.
Yeah, no, a wonderful example. And again, it's not what I've seen, again, because I've known these leaders for so long, is that another opportunity comes down the path, but all of them, many of them, Kelly, have a similar story where right at that moment, it wasn't the right time to do the next step because of whatever was happening in their lives outside of work, but trusting that another opportunity was going to come along. And again, these are leaders who've gone on to quite a bit of success, but I don't want to pretend that they also didn't make some choices. And one of the themes that came up over and over again was what's enough? What's enough work? What's enough money? What's enough time at family? Like there's choices we need to make. I'm going to put up another slide just for the fun of it that is some more pictures from the summit as we speak a little bit more. Again, lots of pictures of guys. I think it's really important that men are a part of the discussion, old and young. But this you're getting at a really big important point. One of the parts of courage is trying to think what's enough. How do we decide what we can do right now, what we can do later? And this is certainly to do with overwork too. Any other big insights from your table discussion, or maybe we do something called a walk and talk where people get to go and walk with people. Any other moments from that day that you want to share about the courageous conversation you have to have at work or at home? Kelly, I was so glad you're there.
I personally was really struck by a comment that a man who's kind of, I guess, mid-career, I would say, man-made, which is that the reason setting boundaries at work was hard for him, and I think this resonated with me and a lot of people, was because his ego and self-identity was really tied up in work. And that was really, reasonable. It struck me. Yeah. And so to step back at all from work, the courage for him, it wasn't maybe a slightly confrontational conversation with somebody, or the work that's required to come up with a new system within your office and just kind of fighting inertia or whatever it is. The courage for him was a more personal, internal courage, which was to rethink his identity a little bit and maybe re-describe for himself who he wanted to be and what was important to him.
Yeah, well, I'm going to share a moment of this summit that was really a powerful moment for me because, it's been a long journey growing Third Path for the last 20 years. And one of my pioneering leader groups actually gave me an award. So that you see that me standing there with an award. And I think it goes back to this mindset we're talking about, this values we're talking about. What I see in all these pioneering leaders is that, of course, work is important to them, but so is life. And here's the crazy truth about egos in all of this. What it means is that these leaders understand that they're not this be all of their organization. They are part of their organization, and the organization should live beyond them. And so what I think we're going to see is these pioneering leaders are actually this different approach, and not just seeing themselves identified as just defined by work, helps them become a leader that then can pass the organization on to the next generation even better, because they're not so wrapped up in that work themselves. They love their work, but they have a life too. And so again, back to that concept across the life cycle, I think when people follow this integrated path, they live a happier life when they're raising children. They have some more time to care for their aging parents. They become better leaders who help people work more effectively, and then they can move on and support others to lead. And that's just what you said, Kelly, because it's not just about their egos. It's about living a whole life, a full life. You might have one last thought you want to say, Kelly.
Oh, Jessica, I have so many thoughts. I will limit it to this observation. I'm looking at the photographs in this picture of the summit, and then one of the earlier slides of the summit. These are faces of people who do not look stressed. I think about what Brigid was saying about the impact of work on your health, and I see something different in these faces of people who I'm sure no one has succeeded perfectly, but they're figuring something out, and it shows.
Yeah, and they're there. Something like Brigid said too. It's being with other people who are willing to think and try together. Just like we get that courage from our family system at home, being with others who are trying to think differently about this around our workplace gives us courage and confidence as well. So I do think at the core of creating an innovation nation is all those people out there who've been willing to have that courageous conversation, to go ahead and talk to their boss, try something different. I actually think I'm going to learn over the next couple of years that there's some of my pioneers have to have some courageous conversations at their workplaces with their peers and with other leaders. So to be continued, but I think we're headed in the right direction, and I think this group of progressive leaders is going to really help us become the innovation nation that we want to become. We're going to get to a place where I give both first Brigid, maybe I'll actually give Kelly, then Brigid the very last word. So we're at the point where we're going to wrap up in a second. And for those of you who are listening in today, again, there is a live Q&A for those who participate in the Thursday webinars. You actually get to talk to the people who are part of the webinars and ask them questions. There's always an interesting conversation that happens after the event. This one might be cut a little short, we'll see. So much to say. But Kelly, I want to really thank everybody for joining us. Stick around for the live Q&A. Make sure you check out some great resources. We've got a couple of them listed here on this screen. One last comment you want to say about what we've been talking about today, how to push back at overwork. Kelly, I'm going to give you one last comment, and then Brigid, you've been listening in to Kelly's thoughts. One last comment from you after that, and then we'll have the live Q&A. Kelly?
Just an encouraging note that someone made at the summit, which is even if culture is working against you, that people's individual efforts contribute to culture change. Yes.
Yeah, I think that sums it up very nicely. In fact, I do believe it's all those people who've gone ahead and tried to make some change that are the future hope that we have that things will change. Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for being here. So glad you were at the summit. Brigid, I'm going to give you the last word. And of course, when we get to the live Q&A, you can ask Brigid some more questions. But Brigid, what's your last thought?
I would just really echo everything that Kelly said. I think that she made a really good point. I talk about the power of culture, the power of environment. People create culture. People create that environment. So think about being that kind of change, and then how your example can ripple out from where you are.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you're listening in today, just to let you know that we do have something called our overwhelm mitigation groups. The name, of course, does come from Brigid's wonderful book. And it's the idea that you can push back at overwhelm, learn some better habits, get smarter both at work and at home so you can feel more successful at work and satisfied with your life. And if you want to learn more about them, there's a way to connect with us on our website, and we can get you some information. So thank you, everybody, for listening in. Stay tuned for the live Q&A. We're so glad you were here today.